Hello, everyone. Welcome to DealStreetAsia's second webinar. I'm Joji Philip, Editor-in-Chief at DealStreetAsia, and I'll be moderating the session today that's titled Open for Business, Sequoia Vertex on Deal Making in times of COVID-19. This webinar is only open for our premium subscribers, so thank you all for taking the time to join us today. We have two of the largest venture capital firms across Southeast Asia and India joining us to share their insights. And a couple of quick points before we kick off. This webinar is being recorded, so you'll get a transcript and video next week. Please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, but just make sure you add your name and organization when submitting the questions. Over 300 of you actually had written in and sent in your questions. The DealStreetAsia team has gone through all of it. We've shortlisted the most important relevant questions, and I'll be asking that to the panelists during the session today. And we've also set aside about 15 minutes at the end to take questions. If there are questions that we can't take at the end, we'll try to get them answered later, either send them to a panelist or have them answered in our subsequent stories over the next couple of days. Let me just take a minute to introduce the two panelists that we have. Abheek Anand is a managing director with Sequoia Capital India and is based in Singapore. He focuses on a range of sectors, including fintech, education, consumer internet across Southeast Asia. Chua is CEO of Vertex Holding, the Singapore headquartered VC investment holding company. He's concurrently also the managing partner of Vertex Venture Southeast Asia and India, as well as chairman of Vertex Growth Fund. Welcome, Abheek. Welcome, Kilok. Thank you so much for joining us today. Interestingly, both Sequoia and Vertex, they were both involved in large deals that got announced earlier this week. Live streaming platform M17 recently announced a $26.5 million round that was led by the Vertex Growth Fund, while Sequoia led the $109 million mega round in Indonesian coffee chain, Kopi Kenningen. Let me just kick off by asking both of you, coming to the theme of the theme of the webinar, and I would like both of you to answer the first question, which is, what do VCs actually mean when they say they're open for business? Is it deal making at the same pace as earlier, or is it infusion of more capital and support for your portfolio companies? Abheek, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Joji, and thank you, DealStreetAsia, for having us. And thank you, everybody, for joining. I think that's an interesting question. A lot of us do talk about being open for business, but I think Joji, you're right. It means a few things. One, and I can just speak for ourselves at Sequoia India and Southeast Asia, we are open for business in the sense that we are very actively meeting new companies to invest in. So, if you were to look at just our investment committee agendas over the last few weeks, it feels like nothing has changed at all. We are busy, we are running around trying to meet people, except we're doing it all virtually. I do think there's a few things that are different in today's world than, for example, the world 3 months ago. One is that much like, pretty much all investors out there is a very perceptible flight to quality. What that means is that, given the uncertainty in the world, people are looking for more proof points in businesses before they pull the trigger. That holds true for example, you mentioned our recently announced investment in Kopi Kenangan. There's a few others that are coming down the pipeline as well. We actually feel that this is a very interesting time to invest because the really good businesses start to stand out. Competitive intensity starts to lower. And so we can focus on investing in businesses where we truly believe in the vision, in the economics, in the path to building a long-term profitable business. So I think that flight to quality is one. I think the second thing which a lot of investors are doing, and we are definitely doing as well, is helping our portfolio navigate the situation. We are fortunate to have partners in China and the US. Our partners in China are a few months ahead of us in terms of having seen the way this crisis has unfolded. And so, our responsibility as investors and board members is really to help our portfolio companies see around the corner a bit. Help them understand where the world is going towards, help them understand what our learnings on navigate those things have been from other markets, and prepare themselves strategically, financially, and even like mentally for the next few quarters ahead. I think that actually is probably the most valuable thing we can do for our portfolio companies And I would say we are spending a lot of time, getting that right. But as far as business as usual is concerned, we have a seed program called Surge. We just kicked off the third batch of Surge. Unlike other batches, this is all being done virtually and is actually incredibly effective and definitely more efficient. We are going to be continuing to announce investments over the next few weeks and months. So, as far as my day is concerned, I feel like it's busier and I have less free time than before.
Hilok, what about you and Vertex open for business? How are you looking at it?
Oh, Vertex, we have two levels of activities, right? Vertex Holding, which is a holding owned by Temasek. We are a global holding company of the 6 funds globally: Vertex Israel, China, US, healthcare fund based in US, and a growth fund and Southeast Asia fund based here. And so for Vertex Holding, it provides a lot of investment supports and everything else. And because many of these funds who are still actively doing things outside Singapore, so open my business means that this supporting staff still need to continue to meet all the requirement of capital call, reporting, and on and so that part, I don't think much change, even though some of them are working from home doing all the necessary stuff. On the Singapore level, we have the two investment team based here. One is a Southeast Asia India team, and the other one is a Vertex Growth Fund team. Now, I think like Sequoia, we are similarly also the two level of activities. One is the portfolio management. This is a very trying times, and portfolio needs to have a lot more communication. One benefit of having everybody working from home is that you don't have to commute anymore, so you have a lot more time to schedule call after call. And you can even do a lot more calls back to back easily. So there's a lot more this portfolio management discussion, have you think about this, have you think about that kind of questions that we do quite a lot with our portfolio company. And then second level is in new investments. We're continuing looking at investment opportunities, but of course we're focusing on people that we are familiar with, and looking at people that we know for a long time, and then try to look at the activities, and that part I don't think we have slowed down too. There's a lot more opportunities because some of the venture firms have actually exceeded the market, but that give us a lot more times to look at opportunities.
Abheek, let me come to you. When you say business as usual, if I'm not mistaken, Sequoia does about 25 to 30 deals every year in just Southeast Asia alone. So what are the fundamental changes that you've made as a firm to continue, deal making at this pace?
Yeah, look, I think there's a few things that are happening, right? One is obviously, let me start off with the biggest challenge all of us are facing, which is that in venture investing is inherently a people business. And, we need to adapt to this brave new world where we are unable to meet people in person and are unlikely to be able to do that for the next several quarters. I actually believe that business travel is going to be, very subdued for the foreseeable future. And so, we need to adapt to that environment, and we are doing many different things to do that. But I think as far as sort of volume of investments is concerned, I think what ends up happening, and again, I'm going to quote again one of our partners in the US, Mike Moritz, who in a recent interview said that the laws of economic gravity are catching up with startups as they do every 10 years or so. What that means is that, we are starting to see companies focus more on the underlying fundamentals of their business and less on vanity metrics like growth, because of two reasons. One, they realize that the pendulum has swung and that all investors are asking the underlying questions on economics and sustainability. And two, there is no growth to be had, right? I mean, a lot of businesses have frankly seen a lot of, degrowth over the last few weeks and months. So what we are doing, and is something that, we've always tried to do, which is asking the question on, what are the fundamentals of the business and what is the path to building sustainable business models here? What has happened for us is that we've realized that as we meet new companies, founders are also oriented that way. So while we might be meeting fewer companies just because fewer of them are in the market, the founders are starting to think the way that we've always thought, which is, hey, growth is all well and good, but underlying business performance is far more important in the long run. And so what we find is that, the number of companies we meet might be fewer, but the quality of the businesses that we meet has actually gone up. Now, that's not to say that in terms of absolute number of investments, 2020 will be as fast or as, productive, if you will, as the last few years. But in terms of, the quality of businesses, look, I mean, venture investing follows a very strong power law. Very few companies end up driving most returns for funds. So our job is not to find 25 companies a year. Our job is to find the 5 companies that will matter. And net in these markets, we just find founders being more sensible, competitive intensity being lower, and our ability to be able to invest in these companies sort of quite enhanced. So at least from that perspective, I think this vintage is going to be, I think, a pretty productive vintage for all of us investors who are investing actively right now.
Just one related question to you, Abheek. So from what you said, does that mean that companies that were earlier being rewarded for top line growth, do you see them losing out at this time because investors were rewarding top line growth?
Look, I think you're right, but that pendulum is literally, I think a pendulum is the right word, because it shifts every few years. In a bull market, all investors start to show up because there's more liquidity. Frankly, a number of investors show up who are tourist investors who are there because they have the capital and they want to deploy it, and they tend to reward growth. In bear markets, those investors tend to sort of shrink back. And so what we find is, you're right. Founders who I was having a conversation with one of our portfolio companies, and actually multiple such conversations, where we basically told them, hey, please don't report vanity metrics to us. We don't care about GMV. We care about net revenue. We care about gross margins. We care about unit economics. What's happening is that is now being echoed by many other investors as well, which I think is good for the founders, because at some point in their journey, they have to focus on that. And the sooner they do it, the better.
So Kilok, when it comes to the Vertex portfolio, what are the metrics that you're looking at for your companies? Is it runway at zero revenue so that you know how long they can survive, or any other metrics that you've started looking at now?
Well, for us, we always don't believe in so-called burn baby burn model. We never believe that, startup just grow for the sake of growing and then subsidizing revenue. That is a sustainable model. So that kind of metrics, I agree, Abhi, that that's something that we don't really focus on. We ultimately looking for what is your unique, sustainable, unique position? What is your innovation? So what are you trying to create that are sustainable long term? You could be losing money short term because of R&D and some of the marketing, but that cannot be the permanent model that you have to do forever. And I think I agree a bit that in the down market, actually, if you look at venture fund, and all venture funds vintage for the down market usually perform the best. The down market venture fund actually perform the best. The reason is not so much of anything else. It's simple economics and number, because innovation will happen every day, every night. Things will happen. Entrepreneurs will start companies. There's a lot of opportunities are being created. In the market as currently, people are more pragmatic, more realistic. They will not probably ask for what the valuation 3 times, 4 times more 12 months ago. They probably will ask for more practical, more pragmatic, realistic number. And for us, it's ultimately what is a fair valuation that ultimately is making return, right? Whatever valuation you got in, if it's over excessively high, you will not make the return that you need to do. But in this kind of market, when people are more pragmatic, you tend to get into the much reasonable value, which I think is important. And the last point, which is important, is a lot of people are focusing on the negative parts. I believe venture is like any other business, need to have a cycle. Once in a while, people need to take a breather. You need to weed out all the weak player, because if you don't, have a lot of people who jump into the industry who drive up unnecessarily the valuation and creating a lot of marginal player, and this will create a lot more damage for long term. So I think this is actually a good thing for long term.
Let me just shift gears a little bit. I just want to ask you a question from the VC's perspective. Ultimately, both of your VCs, you need to return money to your LPs. So in that context, how bullish are you on bargain deals during these times? Who wants? Either of you can go first. Kilok, you want to go first?
No, I think I don't believe in trying to excessively depress the valuation. I always believe that we need to, entrepreneurs that build a great business, you need to recognize the value they build. If they have built something that's reasonable, you need to look at it and say, look, this is a reasonable value, and what we think is a fair valuation. So we don't try to say, if you think the valuation is 10 million, we say it's 2 million. No, that's not our style. We don't try to do that. We think that if the valuation is worth 10 million, we say it's worth 10 million. But in a good time, they will ask for 30 million. That's normal. And then we will have to resist and say, no, just forget it and move on, which we did last year. We walked away from a lot of deals last year like crazy. And I think the important thing is not to do the reverse. If the company is worth 10 million, we say it's 2. And that will be also long term, that will create a lot more damage in terms of relationship. I don't think that's something we do. Yeah.
Abheek?
I couldn't agree more with Keylog. I think, look, the reality is high quality businesses are never cheap. I don't think there's ever been a case where you meet even in a bear market, there are enough investors out there who will reward high quality businesses and help them get a fair price. And so we are never, bargain hunting is never the way for any of us to generate returns. It's always trying to focus on businesses that long-term become valuable. And look, the reality is, we're talking about early stage investments. At early stage investments, the difference between 10 million pre and 15 million pre doesn't really matter as materially as long as you can get sufficient ownership, because over time you're betting on the company becoming really large. Even the difference, I would argue, between 15 and 30, if you believe the company is going to be truly $1 billion business, is actually not that important for us. So we actually actively sort of go out and, I can tell you that the investments that we've made more recently, there has not been very much movement on price. It's just that the completely unreasonable price conversations have gone out the window, and we are still paying up for high quality businesses.
Sticking to deal making, Abheek, just take us through how difficult is it, or how do you do due diligence at these times? Because end of the day, we see investing is a people-to-people business. You meet people, you talk to people. So how do you go about it at these times?
Yeah, look, I think that's an excellent question. And first off, I'll say, we're all trying to figure it out. It's not something that anybody has sort of nailed just yet. I will say 2 things on that. One, let's talk about businesses where we had to do physical, in-person diligence. Let's say, we were trying to invest in, we talked about Kopi Kanangan. Let's say we wanted to try to invest in Kopi Kanangan. Like, that's a chain of coffee shops. And it's impossible for us to go to go to Jakarta right now and actually, taste the coffee in the coffee shops because, we can't fly there. The reality is, in today's world, many of those businesses are really, really hurting, and frankly are not businesses that are going to have an easy time raising capital. So we are actually not meeting a lot of companies that have any kind of physical component to their businesses. We are, however, meeting a lot of companies that are purely digital. We've always said internally at Sequoia, bits is better than atoms is better than cells. So we are meeting companies that rely on bits and not atoms and cells. And so for us to diligence those companies is actually relatively easy, right? I mean, if you want to get a product demo, it's actually easier for us to get a product demo on Zoom than to go meet the founder in person. If you want to look at metrics, same thing. If you want to talk to customers who are all digital and their businesses are still running, it's relatively easy for us to set up a call with any of them. And frankly, it's more efficient because we can call more people. So at least for those types of businesses, diligence has actually become a lot better. Now, I think the challenge is this human aspect of, how do we build a point of view on founders without ever having met them? And I can tell you that we've made a number of bets globally post-COVID with founders that we've never met in person. And, we just use proxies for that. We spend a lot of time on video. We do a lot of references. We spend a lot of time looking at their numbers. And, I don't think that the quality of the diligence that we have done or that I've seen any of our team members do has in any way gone down. I think it's actually gone up because we're just far more efficient doing it remotely.
Kilok, in the case of Vertex, are you sort of going back to founders you had met in the past, who you had passed, who you already know? Does that help in terms of when it comes to deal making during these times, especially on the diligence part?
I think for us, we tend to we have South Asia, India. We have about 16 of us, and Growth Fund we have 6 of us. We know a lot of people. We have our own network of people. So those are probably the first level of people we will go and focus on it, because these are the people you're familiar with. I agree a bit that it's all about face-to-face meeting, right? So if you're somebody that you never met before, first time, it's a bit more. It's a bit more challenging. You have to figure out, this a bit more. But if you're somebody that you know through somebody else and there's some relationship going on, it's probably easier for us. And for Vertex, we are quite different in the sense. Southeast Asia team, we only do about 6-7 deals a year. So we don't really, now we are very focused on the small concentration of the deal. So we need to spend more time with the entrepreneurs who we are familiar with. And so that part, I think, is less of the, challenge. But I also agree a bit that, some part of the due diligence can be done online. You can, you look at numbers, the technology, they describe the technology, they show you what they have done, what they are thinking about. Those are all can be done on the computer anyway. Instead of having a PowerPoint projector onto the screen, now you're projecting onto a computer, which I think that part is no difference. But the physical due diligence part, which most of us doesn't do a lot, this kind of physical, investments, is probably more challenging.
Just wanted to ask you, both Sequoia and Vertex, you do deals across Southeast Asia and India. Are you noticing any differences between the two geographies, or are they pretty similar when it comes to the kind of deals, the challenges? Are they all similar? Kilok, you can go first.
I think there are not much difference per se, but India unfortunately had one short-term effect, which is driven largely by the recent, I guess, regulation of government's action, whereby they are prohibiting Chinese investors, investing in Indian company on the fear that they will buy out all the good Indian company. That had probably put a lot of chill and damper on the, the effect on India. I mean, we all know the past few years, a lot of, tourist Chinese VC that are in India. And, every deal they will reference back to China company and they say, oh, Chinese company, Series A deal is $30 million US, or Indian company, 15 million is really cheap. So those kind of conversation, we had many of that. So now suddenly all these investors disappeared. All the tourists have left. So now we are left with us. So that part, I think, is affecting India a bit more. Southeast Asia, I think, has been more or less a bit more subdued because they left 2 years ago. And I think, so in that sense, a difference is more because of later stage deal, you see a bit more dampening effect because of the Chinese investor have sort of left the market.
Abheek, let me come to you. Any differences between India and Southeast Asia?
No, look, I agree with Kilok. I think, we haven't seen too much in terms of, investment activity being different, being newly different. They were always a little bit different in the past, but, there's never been there hasn't been anything new that's been different. Obviously, there are, government policies that are very different. India is under complete lockdown, and that has affected Indian companies much more so perhaps than Southeast Asian companies. But that's hopefully a temporary thing that should iron itself out. I do think that one thing that Kilok said, which I think makes me sort of go back to an observation from earlier this week, which is we're talking about a lot around investment activity. And thinking, hey, the world has changed, investment activity should go down. But it's helpful to think, for example, what's happening in the public markets as a proxy for what's happening with technology broadly. I mean, if you look at the NASDAQ is back to January 1st levels, right? I mean, it almost feels like the dip that happened because of COVID never happened. Now, of course, the problem is that in the aggregate, the economy is hurting a lot, right? I mean, the US unemployment numbers are 15%. India is projected at 25%. We don't have a lot of numbers from economies in Southeast Asia, but they're going to be hurt a lot as well. We're almost definitely looking at recessions across all of these economies. But one thing that has been very clear is that this has accelerated a shift in both investment interest and value accretion, even more so towards tech companies than non-tech companies. So, as a tech venture investor, look, I mean, COVID is a massive humanitarian, socio-political, and economic crisis that is global in nature. But this has basically accelerated this shift to tech. And at this point, you cannot afford to not be a tech business. So from our perspective, if you were to just look at tech investing, the set of opportunities that exist today and the ones that will come up over the next 12 months are actually going to be really interesting. Because any non-tech business is just going to have a very hard time surviving.
Sure. Abheek, on the just that acceleration part, one of the ways to look at the whole COVID situation is like the metaphor, like a time machine. For instance, in some sectors like EdTech, HealthTech, it could have pushed adoption, like speeded up adoption by 3 to 5 years or even more. But in several other sectors, it's also safe to assume that it's pushed back all the work done by the startups, by the entrepreneurs, by the teams by 3 years or 5 years or 10 years or whatever it is. But how do you reset valuations for such companies even in your portfolio?
Look, I think, again, I want to go back to something that Keelock said, which is, I think, very true, which is valuations are not that important. And the reason for that is, again, over the course of the life of the company, at some point they will be undervalued, at some point they will be overvalued, and net, that stuff gets ironed out in the long run. Because, when we invest for a 7 to 10 year time horizon. We don't invest on what's happening right now. But I think the analogy that you're using is a good one, in that, I sort of go back to, this classic book on technology adoption cycles called Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore, where he has this curve around, the innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority. And, that curve kind of sort of is a normal distribution. And the job of the startup is to keep moving rightwards on the curve, trying to get more and more people to adopt that digital service. I think what has happened is, for a lot of sectors, they've just been moved like 3 steps to the right, which is amazing, right? I mean, like, let's say you're an education company. Online education was a luxury and a preference. Now it's an absolute necessity. We talked about M17, which is, a company that Vertex is a shareholder in. If you are providing digital entertainment at home, guess what? That's the only way to entertain people right now. And so for these companies, I think it's actually a massive boost, because this shift to digital, which would have taken 5, 7, 10 years, has happened in a matter of 5, 7, 10 weeks. So I think that's net very good. Conversely, I think, what also happens in technology is that when markets inflect, companies get disrupted, right? I mean, if you were building an app for a Nokia phone in 2006, you might feel pretty good about the fact that, hey, there is a lot of distribution of Nokia phones. But in 2009, 2010, your company was probably dead in the water, right? Now, the same thing again has happened to such companies where the market has changed so much that instead of that inflection happening in 3, 5, 7 years, it has happened in 3, 5, 7 days in some cases, right? And so it's an acceleration of what happens in the technology adoption curve over time. It's just that we've never seen such a rapid acceleration of that change as we have over the last quarter or so.
Keelock, just a related question. How do you sort of help companies in your portfolio where, for instance, valuations have crashed, the ESOP's values have crashed for the teams, which sort of kept them motivated, the work that they've done over the years, like some of the founders have built with great discipline, that has come crashing down. They've had to lay off a lot of people. So how do you help these kind of companies? How do you sort of motivate them, get them back on track?
First of all, I generally tell founders the layoff should be absolutely a last resort. So generally, so far, most of our founders took this to heart, because I told them that we are in a technology business. You hire the right people, and these people who have the capability, you probably need them 12, 15 months from now. So by taking a very short-term measure of laying them off, and then 12, 15 months later, you need to fill the position, that's kind of silly. So generally, in terms of layoff, that's something that I always advise an entrepreneur. That should be absolutely the last resort. The first step you should do is take pay cut. Some of our founders, some of the CEO, which one of them actually was quite surprised, they took 60% pay cut themselves. Those are the action that we generally recommend that you should do first. So in this time, in fact, if you're interested, I'll send you the webinar we did to the entrepreneur. We told them to analyze it in 3 manners. First, look at the business, what I would say. Some of them, the inflection, some of them have shifted to the right. So you need to analyze those business. Be clear what are the business that are temporarily reducing and what is the business that permanently go away. So that's the first part. Second part is to analyze your expenses. Which part of the expenses that temporarily you need to so-called push it out, including salary reduction and things like this. And last but not least is, of course, is to figure out what is your runway, right? And with all this in place, then if you need to raise money and you need to be realistic and pragmatic about it, and valuation has to be happen to be lower. You have to be as realize that what you're trying to build is something good. Over time, you will recover the value. If you are pragmatic about this, that should be fine. I think sometimes entrepreneurs, it takes a while because a lot of these entrepreneurs, unfortunately, they have never seen this before. To them, valuation is I guess self gratification for them. $100 million means, oh, I'm very worth a lot. 200 million means I'm worth more. Suddenly now you tell them that your more realistic valuation is 50 million. They say, oh, I'm not worth so much. I say, yeah, but you're worth 50 million. No? So that part I think is a bit of kind of discussion, mentorship, talk to them and make sure that they understand that this is not the end of the world. And I think it takes a while. I mean, it's a lot of conversation, and discussion. I think it takes time.
Yeah, I just have one question on valuations, just to take it a little forward. One thing that nobody really talks about, even the industry doesn't talk about much, is down rounds. And I'm sure down rounds are inevitable during these times. And some of the portfolio companies across both Sequoia Vertex may also be confronted by it. What do founders and teams need to watch out for during down rounds? Abheek, you want to go first?
Look, I think, again, I want to caveat everything by saying valuations are all point in time. I think what has happened in our portfolio is a few things. One, we are supporting a lot of our portfolio companies in whatever way we can, financially and otherwise. Because if we believe that this is a temporary glitch, right, they should be able to navigate this glitch without having a very significant, negative event happening in the life of the company. Actually, a down round is a pretty negative event in the life of a company. Not because the valuation gets reset. I mean, there is a fair valuation and it's fine. Like that's just a number, like Hilak said. I think what ends up happening is it becomes a little bit of a, the future impact of these things can actually be more adverse. It could have a pretty negative impact on employee morale. It could be, almost a stigma that the company has to then overcome over many years, where founders ask, when future investors ask, hey, what happened back then? Now, the caveat is that in today's market, everybody understands that things are very different. And, it's almost like, I personally believe the financials for 2020 are always going to be ignored. People are going to go from 2019 to 2021 because, there is just so much volatility in the market today. But what we are seeing, at least, one, we haven't seen down rounds happen yet. They may happen in the future, but I do think that, it's unlikely that, they're going to be substantial because, again, an investor investing in the company today believes that the business still has a right to exist in a post-COVID world. And at least, we keep a lot of dry powder to help our portfolio companies. And if it means helping them sort of get a small bridge to get over to the other side when the markets improve, I'm sure the inside investors will be more than happy to step up.
Hilak, if there is, if at all, let's say, assume there is a downward, as an existing investor, what is the role that you can play? So hypothetically,
we also have a lot of dry powder. Generally, we try to have a conversation with the entrepreneur. It's not so much of focusing on down round or whatever round. It's more focusing on what you're trying to do. What are you trying to build? Assuming the market change your business. And if we're trying to do is makes a lot of sense, we need to bridge them, we bridge them. Doesn't matter because we have enough reserve to help the entrepreneur. The challenge is always when it comes to this, whereby some investors who never have the reserve powder, and then they can't help the entrepreneur. And those are the portfolio that will probably face that down round situation. Which for our case, for Sequoia ourselves, we are a lot more institutionalized, we're more disciplined, we have all the reserve behind. So we will just do what we think is necessary to buy more time for the entrepreneur to build their business.
Understood.
And I think actually, sorry, go ahead. I think Hilak actually hit on a very important point, which, all of us tell our investors, which is, tell our portfolio companies all the time, which is, it's very important to get the right investor on board. And the right investor is not the right investor necessarily for a bull market, but what happens when the market changes, right? I mean, if you have, a tourist investor who sort of is going to completely go away from the market, they are much less likely to support you in a time of difficulty. And so, I think in times like this, the choice that founders make on which investors to partner with really, really becomes important. And hopefully, that's a learning that people carry on from tough times in terms of who they choose to partner with in the future.
Abheek, on the right investors, just have another question. And we've seen, I'm not taking names, but we've seen examples, like we've interacted with founders who've seen term sheets getting pulled. Some of them have even seen term sheets getting revised after they're signed before the money hits the bank. As a founder, how do you deal with such situations?
Yeah, look, I think it's an unfortunate reality in today's market that some investors are being very short-term focused, and we are seeing, including some in our portfolio companies, terms getting renegotiated or term sheets getting reneged. I would say a few things to, we tell our founders a few things. Number one, nothing is certain until there's money in the bank. That is true in every market, but especially true in today's market, right? That's number one. Number two, I think goes back to the previous comment on, the type of partner that you pick. If you pick a partner who's truly committed to the region, right? It's actually reputationally very damaging for that investor to renegotiate a term sheet. I can tell you right now, from a Sequoia perspective, we take this incredibly seriously. If diligence checks out, we close our term sheets. And the reason we do that is because we are committed to the region for a very long period of time. And once this environment settles down, we don't want to have people saying, hey, you can't trust the word of this investor. So, if you take a long-term enough perspective as investors, I think it's important for us, even if it means leaving a little bit of money on the table, to have a reputation that attracts founders in a bull market, because that reputation is far more important to us than any particular investment might be.
So, Kilok, so does that mean a VC's reputation will sort of be determined by how they behave during challenging times like this?
Yeah, I think I think Abheek hit a very few couple of points. I think experienced VC knows that if this is an important market, you build over time. It's not about short-term matters, right? I mean, COVID, how long does it last? I mean, this current shutdown, lockdown, not going to let go on forever, right? Singapore probably will gradually open up the economy. So, some of us can go back to a bit more normal. Some business will pick up, something will return. There's a bit of that temporary measure that people have to understand. Yeah, so I think, entrepreneur eventually will see that difference, hopefully. But the only sad thing is that, as much as I agree with Abheek, I hope entrepreneur will remember this, but I think most of them will not remember. They will, in the good time, they will go back to pick the best, highest valuation. In the bad time, they will come back to people like ourselves, Sequoia and Vertex, and say, oh, you guys are the, shining example of people we would like to work with. Right now, I'm good, in the good time back, they will pick the best tourist VCs, term sheet with 50% higher valuation. That's unfortunate. This is reality of life. We have to accept this is the cycle. Let's move on. Don't take it personally. Yeah.
Look, specifically, because of what you mentioned, specifically, I just wanted to ask you on M17. That company has seen a lot of pivots. It's seen a lot of controversies. It saw a listing in New York fail in the last minute. What sort of made, and you're a very cautious investor, what made you go back to a company like M17, especially during these times, and do such a large round with them?
I think the New York things that largely because of the settlement issue among the so-called bankers that was not resolved. Not so much a company. Fundamentally, the company business was good. The prospectus were large. Everything was fine. In fact, the revenue has exceeded what they have projected during the the IPO time. For us, it's for me. I always believe a couple of things. Everybody made mistakes, right? Everybody will face challenges. The important thing is how did they pick themselves up and move on, right? This is the important thing about life, right? Life lesson. So this team, M17 especially, I feel that when this thing happened, instead of focusing on this banker did not do the job, that banker did not do the job, they focus on their own business. They say, okay, fine, shit happens. Let's focus on our business. There's a lot of great future for our business. Let's execute well. And they have done that. And I think I told before the session began, I told you that when this whole COVID thing happened, they saw the March number is 10% higher than February. They say this is maybe anomaly. And when April came in, it's 15% higher than March. They say, oh, this is anomaly. When the first 15 days of May just came in, they extrapolate, multiplied by number 2, it's going to be 50% higher than April. So so live entertainment, nothing else to do, but you had to do something at home, right? So I think this team to us is sort of validated our support of them, because they essentially learn what they need to learn, pick up what they need to learn, focus on execution, focus on what they need to do, build a business long term, and that's important for us. And it's not so much of you have a small hiccups here, small mistake there. The worst entrepreneur is when they make a mistake, instead of figuring out what the problem is, they blame on everybody else, right? Or China is a problem, Iran is a problem, whatever the problem is, right? This is the worst entrepreneur. The best entrepreneur, they focus on the problem. Yeah.
I just want to take a couple of quick questions before we go to the audience questions from the attendees. Abheek, if I were a founder, would you advise starting up at this time?
So I know this is probably going to be an answer that a lot of VCs say, but I would absolutely say you should do that. And let me tell you why I think that so strongly. One, as investors, we often think about new investments in the context of this very simple question: why now? Which is, why does this business have a right to exist today and not 5 years ago? And typically the answer to that question is an inflection point in the market. So for example, if you were trying to build a mobile business in 2008, the why now is obvious. The iPhone just came out last year. If you're trying to build a cloud business around the same time, you would say, yeah, AWS is starting to get some green shoots. It might be a very interesting platform to build on. So these inflection points generally create lots and lots of opportunity. I think what's going to happen with COVID, like there's going to be this short to medium term impact. But let's imagine what happens long term, because remember, a founder starting a company is not starting a company for May 2020. They're starting the company for May 2027 and beyond. So what's going to happen over the next few years, or even the next few quarters actually, is that not one but multiple inflection points are going to show up. Large businesses that were created and were very successful up until Jan 2020 may suddenly find themselves out of a business. It's not to say that the customer's need for that product or service has gone away. It's just that the business model that existed before that is suddenly completely obsolete and deserves to be disrupted. And so founders always are trying to find a way to disrupt or create a new category. And because of COVID, many categories will get disrupted and many new categories will get created. I would say that's the number one reason to start a company today. There's also a lot of other reasons. A second reason, for example, is that competitive intensity in whatever you start today is not going to be that high. And competitive intensity, I hate competitive intensity because it causes all sorts of perverse behavior to happen amongst investors and competing founders. Low competitive intensity means you can build a more sensible business. And then, look, finally, what's going to happen is, the markets, at least on the financing side, are such that there is still a lot of liquidity available for founders. So it's not as if fundraising is going to become dramatically harder. It might be hard a little bit in the short term, but I do think that's going to rebound very quickly. So suddenly you're looking at a world where you have, a vast menu of potential ways to build a business. Vast. I mean, I think if I were a founder, I would look at every single valuable company out there and look at every single business line and ask myself the question, does that business line deserve to exist today? And if it doesn't, I would go after that business line. I would be able to raise capital because a lot of investors, Vertex, ourselves, a bunch of others, are always looking for new people to invest behind. I'd be able to hire the best quality people because guess what? There's a lot of very, very smart people who are out there looking for a job. And I would be operating in an environment with lower competitive intensity, which means for the next 12, 18 months, I have a shot at building something very reasonable and valuable without taking any of the decisions that people make in a bull competitive market. So I think it's actually I honestly think there hasn't been a better time in a long time to create a business.
Joji, maybe I will jump in to also echo what Abheek said. I think down cycle is probably the best time to start a company. Speaking from my own experience in 1997, when Asian financial crisis, I was still with I was executive of a big company in Singapore. I decided to leave and start a voice over IP company with a bunch of my friends. And a lot of people ask me, why? I mean, why are you doing this? And at the time, what we saw was internet was booming. We think that internet will change everything. Voice over IP will be important. So that we decided to come out and start a company. And of course, a lot of people ask me, say, "Oh, why you do this? Aren't you, it's very risky?" And if everybody forgot, Asian financial crisis really was a big leveler of time. You essentially level everything. Suddenly over time, everybody becomes just no cash and property asset poor and everything else. So I told a friend of mine, this is the best leveler of our time. So everybody start from zero. So I also start from zero. And so therefore, if I build value faster than anybody else, I'll get something better over time. So I think this is a great time to start a company. If you have a great idea that will change everything, this is the best time to start a company.
Got it. I'm going to look at some of the questions that have come in from the attendees. I'll start with this question from Randy of RC Consulting. It's to both of you, asking you if you're preparing your respective portfolio companies to plan for a minimum of 12 to 18 months of uncertainty, or are you preparing them for a shorter period? And how are you preparing to manage their cash flow accordingly? Abheek, you want to go first?
Sure. So Randy, the advice that we are giving to our portfolio companies broadly is, one, cash is king. And I mean cash specifically, a little bit about what cash means. And we are asking everybody to have a clear path to 18 months of runway, if possible. Now, what I mean by cash is king is that, accounting measures are less important. If you have a bunch of cash that's stuck in working capital cycles, if you have to do a lot of capex, if you have a lot on the balance sheet that doesn't show up in your bank account that can't be used for opex, that doesn't count. So we are asking all portfolio companies to revisit the way they're managing cash and manage that very prudently. The reason we are suggesting 18 months is, look, I think there are still a lot of companies that are counter-cyclical. I think M17 was a great example. We have a number of companies in our portfolio that are very similar. They'll find it very easy to raise cash right now. But a company that is waiting for the market to turn might need, let's say 6 to 8 months before they can actually go out and the market is turned. Oh, and by the way, it turns out, going out to fundraise in October, November is a terrible time because, December's coming up, people start to sort of lose steam a bit. So let's say you want to fundraise in January. The advice we give to everybody is always fundraise with at least 12 months of runway. So if you want to fundraise in January 2021, and if you want 12 months of runway, broadly speaking, you need to have at least 18 months in the bank right now to be able to get to that point. And that's broadly the advice we're giving to our portfolio companies.
Kilok, from your end, any particular advice for your portfolio companies?
Yeah, I agree with everything what Abhi said. Except a few minor things that we, comments we to our entrepreneur that firstly, we think this so-called current movement control measure is going to go on until maybe more like early next year. And some country, everybody has some form of traveling restrictions, and all this is going to go on for until that time. So basically, whatever activities that you need to plan that require movement, up to January, you better exclude that activities for the moment. So that includes fundraising or many other things. So that is the first point in time. What is more fundamentally more important for us actually is also asking the entrepreneur start thinking beyond that. So some of the entrepreneurs, we are asking them to think about these questions. What is going to be like 18 months from now? So this is the important question, right? Because we just saw the WHO chief scientist publish a conclusion, and she said that she thinks this COVID is going to be asked for 4 years. So, until under some kind of scenario. So that means this kind of control, restriction, or travel is going to be some form that means that the world that we all know 6 months ago is not going to happen again for a long time. So the question that we are asking the entrepreneur to think about is beyond the 18 months runway, we need to ask ourselves, beyond that, what is it going to be like for your business? And that is an important question too. And that's something that some of them have to think about that question. It involves reconfiguring the business too, because you had to start reconfiguring the business now, because that is a 18 months problem 18 months from now.
You had mentioned, when earlier you had talked about one of the things that you had mentioned with regard to India was, India taking a hard stance against Chinese investors and Chinese VCs, and that may have an impact. But at the same time, just wanted to ask you, what do you think of India's recently announced lookies policy in terms of looking at Southeast Asia, where they're looking at looking at where they're asking Southeast Asian investors to come to India, Indian investors look at Southeast Asia, looking at alignment between both the markets. Do you think that will work?
Yeah, that's a good. That should be that is a logical conclusion. I mean, historically, Southeast Asia and India has a lot of relationship. There's all immigrants and everything. There's a lot of cross fertilizations, and then this has been historically going on. I think this is a very good policy. I think this is a great thing that is going to happen. For the India and Southeast Asia.
Abheek, like you said, you're working from home. All of us are working from home. As a VC, what are your key observations, like in terms of when it comes to working from home, and what are the habits that you think will forever permanently change that will have a big impact on businesses going forward?
Look, I think it's interesting. I go back to some of the tech companies globally and what they're talking about in terms of work from home. I mean, you guys probably heard Google announcing that work from home is an option until 2020. The rest of the year, Twitter announcing that they're always going to have a work from home option for the foreseeable future, even beyond 2020. I think it's actually quite interesting. What a lot of us are discovering is that a lot of stuff that we thought was essential travel has become completely non-essential. And we are realizing that even if we can get 80-90% of the way there without actually getting on an airplane, that is more than made up by the increased efficiency that we have. So I think what's going to happen is business travel is going to fundamentally look very different for several years to come. I don't think, this era of all of us waking up at 5 a.m, getting on a flight to do a meeting in Jakarta and coming back, and Keelog is laughing because I'm sure he's done like hundreds of those. I mean, that's not going to come back anytime soon. I think what I think is a more interesting thing that we all need to figure out, and this is sort of true, I think, socially for all of us, not just for investors, is if you have work from home as more and more of a norm, what does that mean for, our quality of life? On the one hand, we're much more efficient, but high efficiency also comes at a cost. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I don't know the difference between a weekday and a weekend anymore. And in the beginning, it's great, you feel so productive, but 8 weeks later, you realize, oh my God, I have a bunch of white hair. I'm starting to get more of those. So I think, managing happiness and mental health and productivity over the very long period of time, I think that's an unanswered question that needs to be figured out by all of us. And we don't have a choice but to figure it out.
So when it comes to these issues like mental health or productivity, happiness, all of that, these were not really, in terms of VC value add, no VC, I'm sure these are not things that you really looked at earlier. Even as a firm, are these things that you need to learn, like in the sense that when you have conversation with your founders, ask them on these kind of things, which you may not have been part of normal conversations earlier?
Oh, I'm happy to sorry, maybe go again, because this is actually a topic that's sort of pretty close to my heart. One of my partners, Mohit, last year wrote a post on LinkedIn called "It's Okay to Not Be Okay," and this was last year, by the way, or maybe even the year before that. And the reason he wrote that was because our observation has been that entrepreneurship has always been an incredibly lonely journey. I mean, if you think about founders, right? I mean, a lot of founders, for very good reason, have to project an external aura of confidence while hiding or suppressing any sort of questions or doubts that might exist in their minds. And so, founders typically tend to not be very vulnerable. I mean, as VCs, we see this all the time. We reward founders who are chest thumping and telling us all the things that are going wrong and ignoring everything that are going right and ignoring everything that is going wrong. So at least we think that, look, I mean, entrepreneurship is not just a marathon, it's an ultra marathon. It's like, a decade-long journey, if not longer. And so, being in the right frame of mind and, one analogy we use a lot is that of, professional sports teams. How many professional sports teams have managed to stay at the top of their game for 10 years in a row? Has anybody won any international tournament 10 years in a row? I'd really struggle to think of any such team. But that's what every founder has to do, win every year for 10 years in a row like a professional sports team. And the way you do that is by focusing on longevity and not as 10 one-year sprints. So I think it's always been important.
Yeah, I agree. I think that being a founder is a very lonely business. because you raise money from investors, and you don't want to disappoint them. You always want to deliver good news, and in this kind of difficult time, is investor like Square ourselves, which we have seen many of this cycle. We know how is it like, so we will have a conversation. We talk about the issues, and the important thing is to make sure to focus on the positive and then negative. And the important thing is, if you have a problem, so be it. If you have a solution, move on. That's it. There's no need to dwell on it. I mean, everybody, will have, hiccups, right? I mean, there's nobody have hiccups, so, what's the problem here? So I think it's normal. So I think in this difficult time, we typically tell entrepreneurs, you need to talk, call us, of course, don't call us at midnight, call at normal time. We can talk. We can talk for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, talks about issues, what you think is bothering you, and then we talk about it. Doesn't matter. I mean, you don't have to feel weak because you have to talk about, I'm having this issue and that issue. That's okay. I mean, everybody have issues, right? So that's normal.
Okay, look, I have a question for you from Hans Carter. What's your view on these Southeast Asian unicorns in the changed environment? Do you think that with the changed consumer behavior, do you think some of them or many of them may be valued? How do you see the road ahead for many of them? You are an investor in Grab. So overall, just not any specific company.
Well, I guess, to be fair, not just Southeast Asian unicorn, any unicorn in the world, I think this is going to be a challenge, right? Because we are sort of in the perfect storm, right? Firstly, we have the SoftBank defect, then we have this trade war going on, then we have this COVID-19 situation. So the good time of valuation always marking up higher for the next round, I think it's more or less over for a period of time. So some of these unicorn, unfortunately, may not be able to raise money at the same unicorn value anymore, maybe lower or whatever that is. But I think it's fine. I mean, so long as you are dominating in your market, you are still number one, you are executing well. So what? Valuations 5 billion versus 3 billion is still a billion, right? But I think there's no issue on that basis. I think it's all focusing on execution and continue to dominate your market. I think that's the most important.
Abheek, another audience question. What about companies like Gojek, Zilingo, One Championship? Their prospects might change quite a bit because of COVID. What's the road ahead for me? And you're an investor in many of Sequoia is an investor in these companies. How do you see the road ahead?
Look, I think it's hard for me to comment on individual companies. I do think, going back to an earlier comment in which, the world has changed quite dramatically. And one of the things that we at Sequoia believe in is that on average, by and large, change favors startups more than it favors large companies. Startups have an ability to morph and adapt to that change far more than anybody else. Again, we're talking about specific companies, but if I had to make a personal investment of my own capital, I would put it in a startup like Zilingo or One Championship any day over a large company like Singapore Airlines. Right? I mean, the reality is all of these guys started from scratch relatively recently, and they've managed to build an organization and a culture that thrives on high performance and adapting to change. So yes, of course, there's going to be challenges because, the market environment has changed quite dramatically. But I think we should always believe in a power of a startup to adapt very rapidly. And we're already starting to see that in many companies in our portfolio. So it's actually quite incredible to see how quickly they have changed things in response to what's happening in the market.
Okay, look, at Vertex, what's your investment outlook?
There's one important point. I'll just add what Abheek said. I think it's a very important point that we need to bear in mind. Whatever is happening now, there's two phenomena here, right? One is temporary, one is permanent. So all companies, startup or big company, they all will have certain setback, right? So the important thing is which part of this component is temporary. That means the demand is temporarily disappeared, or which part is like Abhi was saying that the business traveling is going to be different, completely different, right? So which is permanent, right? So I think this is the part that for as investors you need to differentiate these two, right? Because I don't think everybody is down, but not all down are the same. Some are permanently down, some will be temporarily down, then will be back to normal over time. I think that's important to make the separation.
We've hit the 1 hour mark. I just have one or two final questions before we wind up. Kilok, at Vertex, what's the conversation that you're having internally? What's the investment outlook looking like for the next 24 to 36 months?
I think the most important questions now that everybody don't have hands around is what is going to be like for this COVID-19 in terms of for the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and so on and so forth. If you have a chance, you go and look at this New York Times. There was this very nice article written by this reporter talking about what he think that 3 possible scenario of a COVID situation, right? First, he calls slow burn, which all of us hope is going to happen, slow burn, right? Basically, we'll have a peak in June. But after fall comes, it will be smaller peak, and thereafter next year it will sort of disappear. That's what we all hope will happen. I don't think that's going to happen. The second scenario is what called the peaks and valley, right? We will have a June peak, then we will sort of manage better, and we'll open up the traveling a bit. Then we have the so-called fall peak, then it will come down a bit. Then every 6 months, we have a peak in terms of so-called COVID-19 infections and spread in the environment community. The third one, which is the worst case, which is to believe that there's a possibility this virus may mutate over time. Right? So we'll see this peak, and the next fall we see a bigger peak, and the spread will continue to go on for a long time, which everybody hope that this is not going to be the scenario. So now the conversation that we are having a lot of time with them among our portfolio and among ourselves is to ask ourselves, take these 3 scenarios and ask ourselves, as applying a certain probability in each of them, and in this situation, how do we do a better job in terms of investment, managing portfolio, in terms of execution going forward? Because I think working from home is going to be a permanent feature for most companies, not just Twitter or Google. I think a lot of us probably will do this for ourselves also going forward, and this will change the working environment. This will change many things, right? So because of all this change, the investment environment is different, the portfolio is going to be different, the revenue is going to be different, the opportunity is going to be different. So this is a part that we're now trying to have a lot more conversation around it. What does it really mean in each of these scenarios for each of the opportunities?
Got it. Abheek, the last question of this webinar is to you, and it's one of the audience questions. I'll just read it out. It's from Deepak Saluja. He wants to know what's the outlook on digital consumer financing business in the short to medium term. Will the benefits of under-penetrated markets from a credit perspective continue to outweigh the collapse of consumption demand in the medium to long term? Would you fund a new business in this space?
It's a good question. Thank you, Deepak, for asking that. Look, I think, let me sort of go back to the fundamentals of consumer lending. What is consumer lending? Consumer lending is basically the equivalent of, standing on the corner of a street and handing out money. It's actually very easy to do that, right? It's the collection that's hard. It's the risk control that's hard. I think the part that we would sort of caution everybody who's doing any form of lending right now is what's happened is actually several sort of unique things that have come together to make the demand for consumer lending incredibly high, which is a lot of consumer lending companies have stopped. There has broadly been, government, support to try to prop up lending. And on top of that, there is a massive drop in, overall GDP output and specifically in things like unemployment. There's a massive rise in that. So what that means is demand for these services is actually incredibly high. You have 25% unemployment in a country like India. Guess what? All of them want financial support to tide over things. That actually makes it a very, very risky time to be lending. So, what we are advising all of our portfolio companies in lending is to be extremely cautious in this market. It's very easy to give out money. It's incredibly hard to make money back, especially because we don't know, like, as Kilok said, we don't know how long this will last or what the recovery cycle will look like. So, I would sort of urge extreme caution in that market, and, don't be tempted by, low customer acquisition costs, high demand, ability to charge more. That's all there for a reason. We need the underlying economy to stabilize before something like lending can become viable and profitable again.
Yeah. Thank you, Abheek. Thank you, Kilok. I'm sorry we can't take more questions. For the remaining questions, we'll try and get them answered post the webinar. Thank you all for joining in for the webinar. Lots of insights, lots of learnings. We'll send across the transcripts and the video to all of you so that you can re-listen to it. Once again, thank you all for joining in, and hope to have you on board for our monthly webinars going forward.